All right, everybody, good afternoon. It's time to take a look at some more receivers, and we're going to pull our eyes back just a little bit here. The first video I posted, the video this morning where I was talking about receivers, I was mostly focusing on guys who had really good upside. Even if that upside was very unlikely to ever be realized, it was there. And those were guys who I would be okay spending a little bit more on because I feel like there's at least some higher ceiling that is unlikely to be reached, but at least it's present. These are guys who I feel more like are just kind of solidly put into where they are in this league as competent role players who can catch a couple passes a game and won't embarrass you, but also there's just very little upside, and because of that, they're probably relegated to that $3 to $5 million range, I would say. So let's go ahead and hop in, starting with I think one of the more interesting receiver free agents, Parris Campbell. Second round pick. This is another guy who was a high draft pick, and it didn't work out. It started to kind of work out in 2022. He had 63 catches, 620 yards, 3 touchdowns, by far the best season of his career, but he was kind of playing on a terrible team that had to pass a lot because they were always behind. I don't know if you can give him a ton of love for it, but he finally produced. He showed he wasn't a complete bust. And PFF, even in this breakout year for him, didn't love it. They were pretty lukewarm on what he did. But again, at least he finally started producing. Um, Seems like there might be something here. At this point, I'm inclined to believe that he's never going to become the stud that people were hoping when he got drafted, because obviously, second round pick, you're expecting the receiver to become something kind of special. But I guess there's maybe some tiny little sliver of hope that he can become a stud. And at this point, I would feel pretty okay about saying you can have him on the roster as like your fourth receiver. You need guys like that, right? Like if you're going in with three receivers you really like, Lockett, Metcalf, and X, then if Parris Campbell's your number four and you know he's going to have to go in when somebody gets hurt, you could probably live with that. Now, Spotrac is giving him a very reasonable deal of 1 year, 2.5 million. I think that's probably a little cheap because he is a second round pick and because he had decent production last year. I would say more like 1 year, 3.5, maybe 1 year, 4 million, and I would be amenable to that. Okay, next guy is Nelson Agholor, and let me just say this right now. I'm very hesitant to go after guys who are notorious for having weak hands, and Nelson Agholor is kind of known for having pretty bad hands. But despite that, he has found a way to be a relatively productive player, and he's coming off kind of a down year, so the price is probably going to be a little bit lower. So, a couple years ago, he had kind of a career year in Vegas, 900 yards and 8 touchdowns. It was the best year of his career by a pretty decent margin. And then he goes to New England on that or well, not big, but sizable contract, and it didn't really work out. He didn't even top 900 yards over the 2 seasons combined. Um, by the end, he wasn't even a consistent starter. So Nelson Agholor, what's he going to go for at this point? He's 30. He's already realized his ceiling. He's never going to be a star receiver in this league. His PFF grade in 2022 was not very good. It was a little bit better the year before, but this is a guy who is a couple years removed from being a genuinely good receiver in this league. So Nelson Agholor at this point, what's he going to take? Like 1 year, 5 million, 2 years, 10 million, probably something in that range. I'd be open to it. He's clearly found a way to be a productive receiver in this league despite his limitations, and I'm not totally against it. Here's a mouthful right here. Olamide Zaccheaus, receiver, diminutive but productive for the Atlanta Falcons. Going to turn 26 this offseason, so there is some potential for unrealized ability. And he's coming off a career year. He had 40 catches for over 500 yards for Atlanta in 2022. He's got 2 straight seasons where he's played every game, which is obviously a plus, obviously a little encouraging. He's not been in the best of situations in Atlanta, but has found a way to gradually increase his production with every year he's played. And PFF is okay with him. They like him decently. They're not in love, but they look at him and go, okay, this is a player who belongs in the NFL. The last couple years, it's been about the same. So Olamide Zaccheaus has to be part of the conversation if you're looking for receivers who could play for you, but you only want them to play a little bit. Like, I'm thinking about the way we would sometimes use Penny Hart, where he just plays a handful of snaps a game. I'd really like to give those snaps to somebody a little bit better. A guy like this could absolutely fill that role. Spotrac says 2 years, $7.5 million. Seems about right for a guy of his production, his stature, and maybe a little bit, just a little bit of an ability to get better in the coming years. Next up, we have Mack Hollins. This was Johnny on the spot for the Raiders in 2022. You take a look at it, and you can see that he had been in the league for several years and hadn't really done much. He was on the Eagles team that won the Super Bowl, but wasn't a big producer, was just kind of bouncing around the league, went to Miami, went to the Raiders, and then on the Raiders, he was able to benefit tremendously from them losing Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller. He had almost 700 yards, had almost 60 catches, was a pretty productive player, did fairly well, and now he's probably going to make himself a little bit of money because he was Johnny on the spot. But given the fact that he had already established a career of not being anything special at all, how much? PFF was not in love with him in 2022. It seems like his production was a product of the situation more than his ability, but it's not a bad grade either. It's still decent. And it's hard to really take a look at any previous year that he played because he produced so little, but it does seem like it was his best year to date. And Spotrac actually has a projected contract for him, 1 year, $2.4 million, which seems a little low to me. I would imagine he gets at least 1 year, 3, maybe even 3.5. He did the thing last year. That's got to be worth something to somebody. But would it be worth that to me? Potentially. Another guy I want to take a look at here would be Noah Brown. This is another guy who kind of, well, I don't want to, put a negative connotation on it, but he benefited from circumstances on the Cowboys where you had Michael Gallup coming back from a serious injury and they needed somebody to kind of fill that gap, and Noah Brown happened to be the guy. So kind of like what Hollins was. And by the way, when Gallup came back, he wasn't 100%. So he was able to benefit from that situation, and he had a pretty decent year. Over 40 catches, 550 yards, 3 touchdowns, played every game but one. And I'm obviously not going crazy with it, but he proved that he belongs in the NFL. Now, this is another guy who has a reputation for not having great hands, which definitely puts me off him a little bit. But I think that there is some theme of interest here with Noah Brown, and I would not particularly mind if the team decided to make him one of their fringe depth receivers, a guy who isn't there just to fill a roster spot, but is kind of there to just, be competent depth. PFF, by the way, not really in love with what he did in 2022, so this guy's a role player, and he's probably going to get a role player salary this year, probably something like 1 year, $4 million, maybe a little bit less just because of the lack of efficiency, but these are the kinds of guys you need sometimes. One name left here, and this one's really tough for me. It's Darius Slayton. Kind of tough for me to read this one. This guy's a really nice deep threat. Still young. He's going to be 26 this year, so he's still got some upside. But you know how everyone always says that the Giants don't have any good receivers, that all their receivers are practice squatters? Well, Darius Slayton is a Giants receiver, so if you're going to talk trash about the Giants receivers, you're talking trash about Darius Slayton. And he's had moments of clear production. Like, you actually look at his career, it's pretty good, right? It's like, wow, this guy has been more productive in 4 years than Mecole Hardman was with Kansas City. And look at the massive downgrade he's had at coaching and quarterback and teammates. He's got 15 touchdowns over the last 4 years. He's got 170 catches. He's got 3 seasons where he had at least 700 receiving yards. Like, the numbers are nice, right? You could look at these numbers and almost convince yourself, hey, why isn't this guy getting the $40 million contract? Why is this guy going to be cheap? And I do think he's going to be cheap. And the numbers will probably make him a little bit of money. The 2021 season he had, by the way, was really ugly. His catch rate was really low. And that's kind of the problem with Darius Slayton. He's got bad hands. This is another guy with lackluster hands. So it's hard for me to get super excited about investing something in him. But it seems like there's a little bit of a stigma here. He has a stigma of being one of Daniel Jones's receivers that we all dunk on all the time because they suck. So if you think Daniel Jones's receivers suck, you kind of think that Darius Slayton sucks. PFF actually thought he played fairly well in 2022 for whatever that's worth, and that was a big improvement over what he did in his crappy 2021. And they've generally, I think, liked the way he's played over his career other than that one season. That being said, Spotrac estimates 2 years, $7 million, so pretty cheap. And I don't know if we need another deep threat on this team, granted, and Darius Slayton that's like his main thing. He's a deep threat. But if you can get a receiver of this level of production for 2 years, $3.5 million per year, I would probably jump on that. So that seems like a really good option to me as well. All right, guys, that's a look at some fringe depth receivers who have caught my attention, who I like. These are guys who you can have on your roster, you can play a little bit, and also count on them to do something positive if your top guys get hurt. We're going to do one more video later today where I take a look at some true depth receivers. Just some guys who I like, who I think could really round out the bench. See you guys later. Go Hawks. Hope you guys learned something.